So, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. And my name is Professor Nigel Leask in the School of Critical Studies at University of Glasgow. Big welcome to this afternoon's event, COP26, Poetry and the Climate Crisis, Scotland and India. Rabindranath Tagore and Patrick Geddes, interpreters of Earth Studies. So this session is the first of two this afternoon and one for next Thursday, sets the scene with Patrick Geddes and Rabindranath Tagore, crucial figures with a long legacy in Scotland and India, addressing the historic relations between Tagore, Geddes, and the leaders of the 1920s Scottish Renaissance, Hugh MacDiarmid, and their legacy for modern poetry. And some of the questions we'll be thinking about will be, how can poetry be of practical help in the climate crisis? How can it set the tone for the contemporary debate? How can it inform a collective response across continents? The event's part of the Being Human Festival, which is taking place across the UK between the 11th and the 20th of November. It's the only national festival of the humanities. It's run by the School of Advanced Studies, University of London, in partnership with the AHRC and the British Academy. Please Google the Being Human Festival website if you want to see a full programme of events, and also if you'd like to make a donation to support the festival. So in this first session on Tagore and Geddes, we've got four distinguished speakers, and each will be speaking for 15 minutes. We've got quite a tight schedule, but we'll, at the end, after our four short papers, we'll have a 10-minute question and answer session. So please do ask any questions you have then. And I'm going to introduce the speakers in order. I won't introduce them all at the beginning, but I'm going to start by introducing our first distinguished speaker, Professor Debarati Bandyopadhyay, who's speaking on Tagore and Geddes, the Environment and Modernity. Debarati Bandyopadhyay is Professor of English at Visva Bharati, which of course, appropriate enough, is the university created by Rabindranath Tagore himself. And Debarati works on eco-criticism and new nature writing, and she's written an eco-biography of Tagore. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Debarati.
Thank you, Nigel. I will begin again without much ado, and I am going to talk about Tagore and Geddes and how they look at modernity as well as environment. And I believe that in Crisis and Civilization, in which the poet Rabindranath Tagore wrote about at the fag end of his life, I begin with that. Crisis in Civilization refers to the poet Rabindranath Tagore's sense of disillusionment with the nature of the modern civilization in more senses than one. As an eminent linguist, my erstwhile senior colleague, Professor Udayanaran Singh, analyzed the word crisis with reference to its Proto-Indo-European verb root cry in the sense of straining and differentiating, and the Greek word crisis used in the ancient times by Hippocrates in the medical sense of the moment of crisis in the life of a patient. Citing this, his suggestion is that we should not consider the expression crisis merely in terms of the realization of the onset of devastation, but rather in terms of a potential turning point, sometimes for the better, in the course of an acute disease. I would begin by conflating these two senses of crisis. According to the general usage since the 17th century, we would be correct in feeling concerned and anxious as it is overdue since the beginning of the early 20th century, and as Tagore points out in Crisis in Civilization, as humankind seemed in 1941, just before his own demise, in the middle of the Second World War, to be committed to a suicidal path. In the medical sense, however, the turning point that a crisis represents could move from the worst to palpable improvement even. I am reminded of Thomas Hardy, who lost the Nobel Prize in 1913 to Tagore. Hardy said that in order to move towards the better, we need to learn about the worst first. Therefore, it seems warranted that we look with the help of Tagore and Geddes at the malady that beset the environment in terms of modernity first, and then note their suggestions about remedial positions that would set us on the path of correction and possibly tenuously improvement. The anxiety about the condition of the environment is directly proportionate to our idea of modernity, in a sense. The stages leading to what we understand as the modern and phases within it have been described by Edward Said in Culture and Imperialism in terms of an extreme unsettling anxiety, extremes of self-consciousness, discontinuity, self-referentiality, and corrosive irony, whose formal patterns we recognize as the hallmarks of modernist culture, a culture that also embraces the major works of, as we all know, Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Proust, Mann, Yeats, unquote. Tagore's name does not feature in this kind of a reading of modern texts. However, to put some records straight, we also need to remember Tagore in the context of modernity. First, presumably the expression modern was being used primarily in the sense of the urban, imperial, Western achievements and culture and environment, while a country like India, that was Tagore's motherland, was largely considered to be rural, backward, a British colony, and hence, though belonging to the 20th century, not quite modern in the same sense. To counter this argument, we have to remember that Tagore belonged to a modern intellectual space as a world traveler, and also India herself is central to our understanding of the relationship between modernity and environment in an altogether different way, perhaps it can emerge. In the Metropolis and the Emergence of Modernism, Raymond Williams wrote that understanding modernism makes necessary looking from time to time from outside the metropolis, from the deprived hinterlands, and from the poor world which has always been peripheral to the metropolitan systems. India during Tagore's time in the 20th century was such a peripheral world as a colony. Within India, again, there was a distinction between the millions of villages and a handful of metropolitan centers. Ordinarily speaking, the disjunction in the socio-cultural experiences of these two categories of citizens of India indicates the complex nature of the Indian experience of the modern world itself. And yet Tagore, with his birth and upbringing in Calcutta, the capital of British India at that time, and the foremost metropolitan center of India, and in his intimate knowledge of rural life since the 1890s, and his repeated visits abroad, was in the perfect position to critique the condition of the environment and its relation with the modern, especially with reference to the intellectually modern, yet peripherally located human being looking at the experiences and influences over the environment originating from the metropolitan center of the British Empire. Second, with reference to the anxiety, self-consciousness, and self-referentiality mentioned in the context of modern Western literary figures, it requires noting that Tagore's writings, with reference not only to modernism, but also the environment, reveal some of these qualities to an extent that we cannot afford to ignore today in view of the mushrooming effects of the environmental crisis. If we juxtapose Tagore's words about the process of modernization as integrally necessary to sustenance of life itself in The Call of Truth in 1921, with his views in an essay, The Modern Age, published in Creative Unity in 1922, the critical stance becomes clear. In The Call of Truth, Tagore hailed modernization unhesitatingly. He wrote, when in the beginning of history, man's lot was thrown in with monstrous creatures, he did not simply take refuge in flight, but set to work with flints to make even more efficient weapons. And so man's instruments progressed from flint to steel. This shows that man's mind had never been helplessly attached to his environment. But if any section of mankind should say, the flint was the weapon of our revered forefather, by departing from it, we destroy the spirit of the race, then they may succeed in preserving their race, but they strike at the root of the glorious tradition which is theirs also. In other words, working with and on the environment have been inevitable for human survival and sustenance, and Tagore never denied this truth. At the same time, there is a word of caution that emerges in The Modern Age, the essay. He wrote, some years ago, when I set out from Calcutta, the first thing that shocked me with a sense of personal injury was the ruthless intrusion of the factories for gunny bags on both banks of the Ganges. The blow it gave me was owing to the precious memory of the days of my boyhood when the existence of a world which had its direct communication with our innermost spirit of beauty was the river. I was fortunate enough to be born before the smoke-belching iron dragon had devoured the greater part of life on its banks. In other words, again, not modernization itself, but its erosion of the beauty, sanctity, and unity of the environment is something that Tagore found jarring in effect. He felt that Calcutta could turn into a copy of the polluted factory towns in England. In the modern age, he critiqued imperialism and commercialization and warned about this age turning into the machine age. He wrote, the prevalence of the theory which realized the power of the machine in the universe and organizes men into machines is like the eruption of Etna, tremendous in its force, in its outburst of fire and fume, but it is creeping lava and its ashes smother life. The modern age, he suspected, would not be life-sustaining. In 1922, Tagore wrote The Waterfall, a play where the machine had been erected in an obscene manner as an embankment cutting off the flow of river water downstream to subjugate the population there. The royal engineer Vibhuti proclaimed with supreme arrogance, my object was to make man triumphant over the sands and water and stones. I had not the time to trouble my mind about what would happen to some wretched maize fields of some wretched cultivator in one place or other. In other words, the collateral damage in terms of human lives and livelihoods was to be ignored along with the environmental consequences in the attempt to control nature for the coercive politics of imperialism, whose effects Tagore and the world had witnessed during the First World War in recent times. In those times. The counterpart of the embankment, fastening its fangs into the breast of the world and rising like a dragon's skull into the sky, was the mining town Yakshapuri in Red Oleanders in 1920, published in 1925, another very famous play by Tagore. Emile Zola's Germinal in 1885, we all know about. Tagore's gold miners suffocate and seek to return to the living gold of the ripe corn in the fields, but the roads are blocked by their masters. There is no path of easy return to the roots of one's own existence and ecological harmony, Tagore warned. And Patrick Geddes did the same, as reflected in his letters written to Tagore during this period. It was from the early 1920s that Patrick Geddes and Tagore were sharing their thoughts about the environment. In his letter to Tagore of 17th May 1922, Geddes wrote about the hexagonal structure he had thought of 16 years ago, incorporating and interrelating elements for an ideal temple for the unity of life, strictly derived from synthesizing. And he said this was about his general knowledge of biology. Environment functioning on organism, yet organism mastering environment. Place conditioning people, yet people reconditioning place working. Now to Geddes, the organism in the form of human beings had mastered the environment and the result was often disastrous, as we all know. His avowed purpose, I quote, to get beyond the mechanistic, pecuniary, this militant pseudo-civilization of the industrial age and towards that of life-teaching biotechniques of world-mending geotechniques such as Wilcott's irrigation antidote to the badly misengineered malaria of Bengal, and with renewed village and town life as ethopolity, such as you are initiating around you, unquote, was what he wrote about to Tagore on 22nd August 1929. To Geddes, in his letter possibly written after 20th April 1930 to Tagore, the modern period required a nuanced environmental reading. I quote, there is not one industrial age of machinery, of mammon and war. Geddes possibly meant that during this age, there were two possible ways of shaping the civilization, suggesting that the former path should be rendered obsolete and the latter path should be welcomed for its sustainability. I quote, the age has also two forms, old and new, paleotechnic and neotechnic. The former characterized by getting up coal anyhow, to get up steam anyhow, to sell them anyhow, to clothe anyhow, to spread them by railways and ships into the empires and for profit anyhow, to be stimulated by successful in gold terms anyhow, has thus had progress for its politics and political economy for its dogma, and the extinguished industrial hells of Britain and America and Bombay too for result, war and anarchies as essential condition. The latter, that is new technique, clearly no incipient science is of energies of nature, electricity, decentralization, cleanliness of all, and to produce increasingly good things. And thus, with mammon becoming exorcised by the good job of social use and service, true crafts and arts and faith again, as old as the regional development, that is agriculture, forestry, etc., unquote. Geddes not only theorized the new technique, but implemented it practically through his diagnosis of the problems in an area and the economical and eco-friendly conservative surgery that he practiced, as in refuting the proposed new gridiron in the streets of Madras, the southern city in India, with enlarging the existing lanes, adding some vacant lots, removal of the most insanitary houses at 1/6 of the proposed cost, ensuring better access to fresh air and sanitation for every urban household over there in the process. His innovative Diwali procession in Indore to eradicate the plague with the tableau of agriculture and Lakshmi leading, and the giant of dirt and the rat of plague to be destroyed following them, ensured cleanliness and cure for the town, which was a very congested one at that point of time. He regularly advised Tagore about matters ranging from water conservation, reforestation, and integrating the different sections of Vishwabharati, the university, in an environmentally sustainable manner. The correspondence between the two bear testimony to their distrust of the prevailing idea of modernity, and there are similarities in thought about a sustainable environment that we continue to note. At the end, we remember Tagore's creation of an educational institution that would ensure through the children a better environment. We are talking about the next generation and the next generation, as envisioned in a poet's school. There he wrote, with the help of literature, festive ceremonials, and religious teachings, I tried to develop in the children of my school their feeling for nature as also a sensitiveness to their human surroundings. I think that the culmination of the complementary environmental and ecologically sustainable work done by Tagore and Geddes is fittingly and symbolically represented in Arthur Geddes, Patrick's son, from there and the human race's future as one from the next generation. Arthur wrote to his father from Tagore Shantiniketan on 23rd March 1923 about their performance of the Masque of the Desert. And this is what I find symbolically so rich about what they were thinking of the future and how they were trying to get it done, implement it. Act 1, the forest hunter becoming agriculturalist, Vedic age, etc. 2, this breaking down through deforestation, drought, famine, the spirit of the desert advances, pushing all before him. 3, the desert pushed back by the Sriniketan boys. They dig a channel for water, who dances along it, awakening quote unquote earth, who throws off her sackcloth and appears in green. General rejoicing. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. That was wonderful. It's a tremendous, wonderful quote there from Arthur Geddes to conclude your talk. So, as I said, we'll be taking questions at the end. And please, to the audience, if you're in the audience and you wish to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A tab there, and we'll try and take as many as we can at the end of the session. Anyway, let's go without further ado to the next talk. This next speaker is Professor Moda Mcdonald. Moda is Emeritus Professor of History of Scottish Art at the University of Dundee. He's author of Scottish Art, published in 2000 and reprinted in 2021, and Patrick Geddes' Intellectual Origins, 2020. He's a former editor of Edinburgh Review, an honorary member of the Royal Scottish Academy of Art and Architecture, and an honorary fellow of the Association for Scottish Literary Studies. He's also a trustee of the Scottish Centre of Tagore Studies. And Murdo's paper is entitled Patrick Geddes, By Leaves We Live. So over to you, Murdo.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I'll just try and screen share here. I think I'll maybe just do without the PowerPoint. It's not really important. It seems to be asking me a whole lot of questions. So first of all, a quote from Patrick Geddes, which it seems to me summarizes what we really need to know about human beings and the environment. How many people think twice about a leaf? Yet the leaf is the chief product and phenomenon of life. This is a green world with animals comparatively few and small, and all dependent upon the leaves. By leaves we live. And immediately we have that very memorable statement. By leaves we live. Now, since Geddes said those words in 1919, By leaves we live has gained a life of its own as an ecological motto. And what a wonderful motto it is. Indeed, it could be the motto of COP26, for it makes the simple point that we are part of the natural world. And the underlying point is that without those leaves, we cannot live, for without them, the air that we breathe becomes unbreathable. By leaves we live, indeed. After those memorable words, Geddes continues, some people have the strange ideas that they live by money. They think energy is generated by the circulation of coins, but the world is mainly a vast leaf colony, growing on and forming a leafy soil, not a mere mineral mass, and we live not by the jingling of our coins, but by the fullness of our harvests. And again, we find another wonderful motto to complement By leaves we live. We live not by the jingling of our coins, but by the fullness of our harvests. Another ecological reminder to all the world leaders who have come and gone in Glasgow over the last week or two. So, who was Patrick Geddes, this man who was so good at coining mottos for our survival? Geddes was born in 1854 in Ballater in Aberdeenshire, and he had an extraordinarily active life as a biologist on the one hand and as a cultural activist on the other. He was a pioneer of the disciplines of geography, ecology, and sociology, and a leader of the Celtic revival in art and literature. Here in Scotland, he was professor of botany at the University of Dundee, and when he stood down from that post in 1919, he moved to India to become professor of sociology and civics at the University of Bombay. But I cannot do justice to his career here, so I will simply summarize it by noting that he was an advocate of environmental and cultural justice. And for Geddes, that justice must begin locally and extend globally. His admirer, the American urban theorist Lewis Mumford, said of him, Geddes's Scotland embraced Europe, and his Europe embraced the world. And Geddes shared that outward-looking advocacy of environmental and cultural justice with Rabindranath Tagore, whom he had met soon after his first journey to India in 1914. It is to Tagore I turn to illuminate Geddes further. Soon after Geddes said those memorable words, by leaves we live, his friend Tagore wrote of him that he has the precision of the scientist and the vision of the prophet, and at the same time, the power of the artist to make his ideas visible. Perhaps we can add to that comment that Geddes has, on occasion, something of the poetical power of his friend Rabindranath to find the right words to get his message across. Indeed, if we take "By Leaves We Live" as a motto for our activities at COP26, we can follow it up with a line from Tagore that comes in the heart of a poem that he wrote in a sense for Geddes, for it was written to celebrate the opening in 1929 of the Indian College in Montpellier in the south of France, a college that Geddes had founded. Tagore writes of time weaving ceaseless patterns of being, and it is indeed time itself that is the other major issue for us at COP26. We need to be able to continue to weave our ceaseless patterns of being in, as Geddes says, this green world, not in a desert. Now, neither of these two friends, Patrick Geddes and Rabindranath Tagore, would countenance environmental action without cultural action and vice versa. Or to put it the other way round, they both knew that political systems that tend to trash the environment tend to trash culture as well. So for both of these key thinkers, cultural and ecological revival went hand in hand. Both Geddes and Tagore understood that sustainable environments depend on sustainable communities, and sustainable communities depend on respecting both culture and environment. The context of COP26 is both cultural and environmental. That cannot be emphasized too strongly. Those two currents, that is to say, what makes people people and what makes the planet, are fundamental, whether we look back to Geddes and Tagore or look to the future, as of course they both did. It is that interdependency of people and planet that COP meetings must address, and that each of us must address every day, whether we like it or not. Some years before he met Tagore, Geddes edited a magazine which understood this interdependence of culture and environment. That magazine is Patrick Geddes's ecological and cultural manifesto in word and image. It is called The Evergreen, and it was a very beautiful magazine that drew on Celtic design. It had an epigraph from John Keats. 4 seasons fill the measure of the year. There are 4 seasons in the mind of man. And in the use of that quotation, we can see Geddes foregrounding the way that we as human beings echo and are echoed in the changes of the natural world. The anthropologist Gregory Bateson would later stress that interdependence in his memorable phrase, mind and nature. Keats's words are underlined in ecological terms in the preface to the Evergreen by Geddes's students, J. Arthur Thompson and William Mcdonald. What they say is, the seasons are the ultimate system in which we live, and we needs must respond, however reluctantly. And then they continue, as the finger acknowledges the heartthrob and the fjord the tides. Now, those natural rhythms, the most personal possible, namely the beat of one's own heart, and the most planetary, namely the seasons and the ebb and flow of the tide, are the substrate to any COP meeting. But we also have in those words the notion of responding, however reluctantly, and the consequences of such reluctance to attend to the environment is the great problem that we now face. Tagore has already reminded us of Geddes's ability to make ideas memorable by making them visible. An example of this is Geddes's wonderful logo, a group of 3 doves that appeared on all his publications, each dove representing a different type of thinking. For Geddes, all 3 were needed to address an environmental or cultural issue properly. The first dove stands for sympathy, that is to say, emotional engagement. The second stands for synthesis, that is to say, intellectual engagement. The third stands for synergy, that is to say, cooperative working together. The need for that cooperative working based on sound intellectual engagement and thorough emotional commitment is again very clear in the environmental crisis that faces us all. It's interesting how many contemporary scholars are now reassessing Geddes as a thinker for the present. My own contribution is the book Patrick Geddes's Intellectual Origins, in which my effort is to emphasize the importance of Geddes's interdisciplinary background, which was formed in the Scottish educational tradition, which has been called by George Davey, the democratic intellect. And other works focus on the significance of Geddes's planning ideas to address today's pressing urban issues. An example is the forthcoming book published by Routledge, India, entitled Patrick Geddes's Contribution to Sociology and Urban Planning. It is by Indra Munshi of Mumbai University. Another scholar and public intellectual who has made a substantial contribution to our understanding of Geddes is Ramachandra Guha, not least in his paper for the India Forum entitled Making Indian Cities Habitable and published in 2020. In a valuable column for the Telegraph India, also from 2020, entitled A Common Thread, Ramachandra Guha has explored Geddes's deep links, not only with Rabindranath Tagore, but with Swami Vivekananda and with Sister Nivedita. Now, the profound linkage between Geddes's thinking and that of Tagore can be given proper context, thanks to Bashabi Fraser's editing of the Geddes-Tagore correspondence, appropriately called A Meeting of Two Minds, and published by Word Power Books in Edinburgh in 2005. But to conclude, I simply reiterate those inspirational words said by Patrick Geddes over a century ago. This is a green world, and then by leaves we live. Those words tell us what we need to know. They tell us what we must sustain. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Murdo. That was wonderful. And you really showed us the importance and the validity of making ideas visible in Tagore and Geddes. That was a tremendous, and thanks again for keeping such good time to your 15 minutes. We'll move straight on then to the next talk by Dr. Arunima Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya is a postdoctoral research assistant on an AHRC-funded project entitled The Other from Within, Indian Anthropologists and the Birth of a Nation at the University of Leeds. She completed her PhD in English literature from the University of Leeds and was anniversary fellow at IASH in the University of Edinburgh. She is the co-editor of Literary Capitals of the Long 19th Century, Spaces Beyond the Capitals, published by Palgrave in forthcoming next year. Arunima's title this evening is The Tyranny of Straight Lines, Beauty, Value and Ethics in Geddes City Planning. So thank you, and over to you, Arunima.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Nigel, for the kind introduction. In today's talk, I will focus on Geddes's engagement with urban planning, its sociology and its philosophical underpinnings, beginning with his report on Bara Bazar, a particular business district of Calcutta in India. Of course, it will intersect with a lot of the things that has been mentioned in the previous two papers, so please bear with me. Because of the time constraint, I will be paraphrasing most of the textual references, hoping to show how his practice as an urban planner connects to his worldview. In 1919, Patrick Geddes published his report on the Calcutta Improvement Trust's plan for Bara Bazar, the principal cosmopolitan business precinct of the city of Calcutta, which was the first capital of British India from 1772 to 1911. Geddes was requested to conduct the survey by the Corporation of Calcutta to evaluate and suggest corrective alternatives to the planning measures that had already been drawn up by the corporation. This was part of the major urban planning drive that was underway in the city throughout the 1920s. In this report, Geddes states his philosophy of conservative surgery, that is to make minimum changes to existing architecture instead of the heroic surgery, quote unquote, of drastic amputation of existing architecture. Geddes was critical of the imposition of a grid-lined symmetry of on the city that in colonial urban planning terms was deemed haphazard and chaotic. In his report, Geddes questions the so-called order of the grid-line planning that created broad roads with neat intersections, having bulldozed the existing socioeconomic networks and community life that the organic development of the city had fostered. He also highlighted the economic stress that such rigorously linear planning would impose on the householders and the municipality also. The government would have to consider extensive relocation measures, creating a floating population that would contribute to the urban crime and unrest. Now I'm quoting here an extensive paragraph from Geddes' report. It's sort of a summary of the report and it comes towards the end. In details then, my plans show slight suggested modifications, which will be seen as of economy in reducing number of minor cuts upon the existing properties, involves great delay in execution by increased inconvenience to householders and increased expense to them accordingly, which is too often beyond the small official space realized. Moreover, the conventional aesthetics of the rigorously straight line of the older Paris-Berlin American school is inferior in architectural effect to those obtained by the economical retention, so far as reasonably possible, of such moderate irregularities of alignment as existing sites involve. Since, when all is done, the costly monotony has thus been thus obtained, the destruction of all variety of features is regretted when too late, quote closed. In opposition to this tyranny of straight lines, Geddes' approach critiqued the normative standards of the CIT, the Calcutta Improvement Trust, and tried to preserve the distinct architectural and urban form and the traditional grouping of businesses of the Bara Bazar area, minimizing demolition and dislocation. Geddes observed that the movement of goods and people in Calcutta was occurring principally from the west to the east and vice versa. But the CIT, the Calcutta Improvement Trust, was inclined on north-south cuts in total disregard of the needs of local traders. A major consequence of the large-scale displacement occasioned by impositions of the Western set designs and urban planning norms, as Parthadatta states in his book and also a journal article titled Patrick Geddes and the Metropolis. So the imposition was of urban planning norms was the heavy taxation levied on all citizens. This also perpetuated the spatial hierarchies of color and class. These imposed plans never questioned power relations in the colonial city. Distinctions like black and white towns in Calcutta were taken for granted and maintained. Geddes challenged the basic assumptions of Euclidean geometry, rectilinears and diagonals, etc., by emphasizing regional and cultural specificity, thereby exposing the inherent hierarchies built into the practice of urban planning. The biggest casualty of standard colonial urban planning norms was the laboring poor. Geddes found E.P. Richards' plan, and E.P. Richards was the official planner for the Calcutta Improvement Trust, suggesting, and Richards suggested, a sort of decanting, and that's the phrase that Richards used in his report, a decanting of the poor from the centrally located slums to the suburbs, financial suburbs. And Geddes sort of critiqued this as saying that it's a financially impractical sort of way of looking at it, and it was a luxury that only the upper classes could afford. However, the official response to Geddes' report was met with mistrust. According to official planners, epidemics and overcrowding needed solutions on a war footing, whereas Geddes seemed not only insufficiently interventionist, but also far too sympathetic to the community. Such suspicion was further aggravated by instances where Geddes argued that neutral issues like garbage, and here I use neutral in quotes, actually hid a deep-seated antipathy for common people. This contention between Geddes' suggestion and the official CIT plan regarding Bara Bazar exposes how the official urban planning directives were uncomfortable with the pre-colonial or early modern forms of capital organization in the city, which were not commensurate with the colonial industrial or financial capital circuits. Bara Bazar was home to the Marwari merchants who had their own model of financial transaction distinct from the organized capital of British trade and finance in Calcutta. The architecture of Bara Bazar, typically criticized for being congested and therefore susceptible to fire and disease, was instrumental in facilitating such local forms of finance and speculation to thrive. The government's justification of progress or development was unable to comprise or allow for the existence of such features of combined and uneven modernization. So I will now quite drastically move to more philosophical writings of Geddes on cities and societies, and hopefully we'll see how this emphasis on organic networks of connection stems from his general worldview that has been discussed earlier as well in the papers before me. This particular instance of Geddes' stance regarding urban planning in India, particularly Calcutta, among several other administrative, academic, and social roles he took upon himself in the country, gives us a route into the way his worldview regarding urban sociology of cities and its larger philosophical underpinnings for society found transnational expression despite the unequal hierarchies of colonial economic systems. In Ways of the Neo-Technique City, the excerpt that is included in Bashavi Fraser, Tapoti Mukherjee, and Amrit Sen edited The Confluence of Minds, Rabindranath Tagore and Patrick Geddes' Reader on Education and Environment. Thanks for the book. It has been really helpful for my PhD and this paper. Geddes critiques the economists' use of utility as a word to measure the value of goods in favor of intrinsic value in terms of life-giving qualities. Geddes suggests that beauty of nature or art is essential for recognizing this intrinsic value and increasing efficiency of humans and nature, which, however, is often sidelined as sentimental by the practical man of reason. This has caused the quote-unquote would-be utilitarian to increase his recklessness towards nature and coarsened his callousness to art. Geddes links the central tenets of city planning, like the hygienist of water supply, to its uses in silviculture, arboriculture, and park making at its greatest and best to create a synoptic vision of nature that meets and combines with city design. The human intervention in this synoptic vision is one of responsibility that is embedded in the ideal of citizenship that Geddes describes as a product of social and political revolution, which will mend the thoughtless plunder of the industrial age by our predecessors, backed by the ideals of liberty, wealth, power of science, and mechanical skills. The ideal of citizenship, Geddes proposes, forefronts human fellowship and helpfulness that can transcend the ideals of the mechanical age, coordinate them with clarity towards a common weal. In this context, such constructive conservation of nature's order and beauty will contribute towards the moral and physical health of cities, he proposes, and transcend engineering to become a master art. To share Geddes' image here, and I quote here, towns must now cease to spread like expanding ink stains and grease spots. One in true development, they will repeat the star-like opening of flowers with green leaves set in alternation with its golden rays, unquote. This vision of approaching built environment is steeped in bridging the ideological and prejudice divides between science and arts, working beyond disciplinary divides to think organically through the connected tissue of all life forms that make the planet. As Geddes describes in his, again, excerpt in this book, Sociology of Autumn, and I quote here, a growing cosmos, a literal universe, of which the protean variety of man and nature are seen to be orderly developments, each phase of being, of becoming, each at once a mode and a mood of universal energy. It is this image of the universal energy that we see repeated in Tagore's philosophy of man and environment as well. And as I guess the other speakers focusing on Tagore's work will be highlighting this, I will bring my talk to a close here. I tried to show how the practical inputs and mechanisms of urban planning in Geddes's practice was rooted in his synoptic view of nature and man. The ethics of this urban vision for cities of the future prioritizes a holistic approach beyond the categorized and divisive fault lines of disciplinary approaches, and ultimately relies on human responsibility to bequeath a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arunima. That was fantastic. Really illuminating remarks there on Geddes' urban planning as a plea for an environmentally responsible and sustainable form of urban planning. So thank you. And can I just remind both panelists and attendees, if you have any questions, please do post them on the Q&A section tab, because we'll be turning to those after the final, the last of our 4 papers this afternoon, in this first section anyway. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Surit Bhattacharya. Surit is a lecturer in postcolonial studies here at the University of Glasgow. He's the author of Postcolonial Modernity and the Indian Novel on Catastrophic Realism, published in 2020. And he's a co-editor of Nabaran Bhattacharya, published in 2020. Surit's interests are include colonial, postcolonial studies, environmental humanities, South Asian literature, and Marxist critical theory. So I'll hand over to you now, Surit.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nigel. This is the advantage of speaking in the end, that in such a well-structured panel, most of the things are being introduced, and it makes my kind of case easier. So I'd like to share a screen if possible here. This is nothing super important. It's just that it'll help you with the quotes that I'm going to be sharing. And I'm going to be reading from the desktop there, so my eyes might be looking upwards from the screen. So the title is An Epidemic of Voracity, Capitalist Exhaustion, and Cooperative Environmentalism in Tagore's Nonfiction. I'm mainly going to be talking about one particular essay. It's called Tagore's Introduction to the Robbery of the Soil by Leonard Elmhurst. So let me go straight to the few of the things that I've written in a page. So in 1922, Rabindranath Tagore, by then widely known as the first Asian Nobel laureate in literature and a noted public figure in India's anti-colonial nationalist politics and culture, gave an introductory speech to his friend Leonard Knight Elmhurst's talk on the robbery of the soil at the University of Calcutta. Elmhurst, a Yorkshire man born in landed gentry and an agriculturalist, came to India to work with Tagore and establish the Institute of Rural Reconstruction at Tagore's famous university in the rural district of Birbhum in Bengal called Bishva Bharati. Elmhurst spoke about how the city was sucking away life and energy from villages and the need for rural reconstructive work, something he also followed in Britain in Devonshire. Tagore's introduction was aimed at the speed and extent with which a rapidly expansive middle class was eating away the resources from villages without returning anything significant, and thus displacing the balance between nature and humans. Given at a time when India was witnessing both rapid industrialization and encroachment of capitalist modernity in the rural interiors for capital accumulation, and the gradual disintegration of collective families, especially in the rural areas, Tagore's speech pointed out the exhaustion of resources and the excess of the social body at the expense of the other body parts that would make the corporeal whole. Throughout the speech, Tagore employed the various metaphors of exhaustion, sickness, nourishment, and giving back. Through reading them, I would like to offer in this paper an impression of how advanced and prophetic Tagore's environmental thoughts were almost 100 years ago, and into his deep-rooted belief in the need for cooperative environmentalism in which collectivity, care, and harmony were at the center of life and living. So just move on with the first. The essay begins with the current rapacious advancement in the colonial metropolis of Calcutta to acquire property and amass wealth, and to express these conditions in ruthless extravaganza. Tagore compares these conditions with forest fire that, and I quote him, feeds upon the living world from which it springs till it exhausts itself completely along with its fuel. Unquote. Appropriation, or rather exhaustion, is at the heart of the essay. Tagore transforms the natural imagery of wildfire to a social imagery of passion and consumption in the next lines, as he writes, and I quote him again, when a passion like greed breaks loose from the fence of social control, it acts like that fire, feeding upon the life of society, unquote. Clearly then, Tagore's intention in the essay is to use imagery from our common parlance to show how they're analogous to what we are doing to each other. Tagore knows that humans will consume what nature has to offer through leaves, fruits, vegetables, as well as meat and fish, etc. But there has been a structural balance between animal consumption of natural resources and vice versa. To establish the point, he gives another example of insects in harvest fields, and I quote him. This is the quote that you can see at the top. There are always insects in our harvest field, which, in spite of their robbery, tend to leave a sufficient surplus for the tillers of the soil so that it doesn't pay us try to exterminate them altogether. But when some pest that has enormous power of self-multiplication attacks our total food crop, we must consider this a great calamity. I'm taking it, as you see, from Fraser, Mukherjee, and Sen's book, Confluence of Minds. This analogy suggests two important things: that the food lost to insects returns with fertilizer for the soil. Rather than robbing the soil, they nourish and help cultivate the soil. The same cannot be said of pests and, say, of a locust attack. Second, that the natural system follows the same path. Our social life is acting like the pest in the name of respectability and living standards. And I quote Tagore again, you can see in the next quote. All the members are goading each other to spoil themselves to the utmost limit of their capacity. Civilization today caters for a whole population of gluttons, and intemperance, which could safely have been tolerated in a few, has spread its contagion to the multitude. The universal greed, which now infects us all, is the cause of every kind of meanness, of cruelty, and of lies in politics and commerce, and vitiates the whole human atmosphere, unquote. This is the epidemic of voracity for Tagore, and he uses this term, an epidemic of voracity, that I'm using from his essay. Well, Tagore does not name the bête noire here, capitalism, although he repeatedly mentions unlimited production and the urban productive system. Greed and exhaustion are metaphors through which he constantly points to the current conditions. Tagore's main critical focus here is urban forms of living. Cities take too much from villages to run themselves, and yet do not return anything of significance to the latter. Consider Tagore's words here, and I'll just change it. The city represents energy materials concentrated for the satisfaction of an exaggerated appetite. And this concentration is considered a symptom of civilization. The devouring process of such an abnormality cannot be carried on unless certain parts of the social body conspire and organize to feed upon the social body. This is suicidal. But before a gradual degeneracy ends in death, the disproportionate enlargement of the particular portion looks formidably great. It conceals the starved pallor of the entire body. The illusion of wealth becomes evident because certain portions grow large on the robbery of the whole, unquote. Reminding of Ramachandra Guha, who has been mentioned here again previously by Murdo, I think, Ramachandra Guha's essay, How Much Should a Person Consume? And there Guha distinguished between city people as omnivores and village people as ecosystem people. When the latter live close to the resources of food and consume as much as needed. This particular quote is an acute and piercing image of capitalist appropriation and exhaustion. The city concentrates wealth into the hands of the few, who then conspire to eat away the resources of the many. Gartha Reed tells us that capitalism, consumption, and addiction are used synonymously in contemporary neoliberal times when there is an abundance of lifestyle and choices on offer for the middle class. While commodities mystify human relations, Reed suggests, and I quote her, specific commodities that are caught up in discourses of addiction also conceal wider social relations, unquote. Concealing social relations indeed is a Marxist notion that Tagore sees to also use here, seems to also use here. Sorry. If you note the quote, he reminds us that the formidably great part of the excessive body conceals the starved pallor of the rest of the body. So one may think here of the French philosopher Georges Bataille, his use of capitalist excess in the book The Accursed Share, who argued that capitalism is displayed through the extravaganza of wastes and transforming material wealth into the symbolic capitalism of excess, such as by throwing parties and doing spectacular festivals by the state, something that the Cameroonian intellectual Achille Bembe called a commandment state in the post-colony. Tagore uses here the notion of the grotesque body to point out the social ills of uneven development. While he continues with the metaphor of the putrefied body, in the interest of time, let me briefly focus on the word robbery. This is the second time we encounter it in the essay. While for the reference to insects that rob food from a harvest field, there was a question of balance and harmony. In this instance, there is no harmony, but the robbery of the body and society. John Bellamy Foster, in his book, The Robbery of Nature, tells us that Marx wrote on the robbery of the soil in his early work, especially drawing from the German chemist Liebig, who was working on the exhaustion of the soil for using artificial fertilizers for intensive agricultural and farming work. Marx drew from his observations for his work on metabolic rift. Human and the non-human depend on nature for their living and return something that is waste that help nature to grow, a point that Tagore also makes earlier through the insect imagery. But because of intensive farming and agriculture, this social metabolism is broken and there is a rift that cannot be reconciled under the current capitalist system, which thrives on creating the rift. Consider Marx in Capital Volume 1, and this is what Marx writes there. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a process towards running the more long-lasting sources of that fertility. Sorry, ruining the more long-lasting sources of that fertility, for which he gives an example of large-scale production in the United States. The point I'm making here is not whether Tagore knew of Marx and Liebig, but rather that both these German thinkers pointed out how capitalist agriculture worked through raw materials supplied and extracted from colonized peripheries. This is what Tagore, as a landlord and an overseer of agricultural tracts, knew all too well. Further, Marx completed the thesis of Liebig by showing how the robbery of the soil leads to the robbery of the body under capitalism, or what John Bellamy Foster calls a corporeal rift. Village, as Tagore would write in the essay, has become a resource hub rather than provider of food and nourishment. Cities are starving and dispossessing villages for their ruinous excess. Under capitalism, the union of humans and nature to produce the social whole is damaged forever. Here, life is literally and metaphorically exhausted. And I have come to my final paragraph. The solution for Tagore lies in giving back. He mentions in the essay, that the final part of the essay, that the point is not to alleviate rural poverty through material consumption or material compensation, which is a result of capitalist exploitation of land and labor, but rather through collective happiness. The way to return the fullness of life for Tagore will be to live, read, and build together, which he did, as he gives this example as well in the essay, through the building of an educational institution, that is Vishwa Bharati, just a year before he delivered this speech. Tagore lived, taught, and oversaw the growth of the school and charity into a university. This was what he meant by cooperative environmentalism, where people and nature would draw from and return resources to each other. In another essay published in the same year and in the book called Creative Unity, the essay is titled The Religion of the Forest and is also there in the edited volume I just referred to. Tagore talked about the role of forests in Indian civilization, how our classical plays continued to remind us during an empire's zenith of material success that finally we would need self-restraints for a balance in life and also in the planet. This may only happen through a recognition of the harmony of contradictory forces through which life itself is formed. To quote him from the essay, and this is the final quote you can see, one truth of which he, that is humanity, must be reminded, therefore, is that the power which accomplishes the miracle of creation by bringing conflicting forces into the harmony of the one is no passion, but a love that accepts the bonds of self-control from the joy of its own immensity, a love whose sacrifice is the manifestation of its endless wealth within itself, unquote. No society can progress without acknowledging these contradictions in the forming of the one, or here the creative and productive unity. He concludes the current essay, his speech rather, the introduction, with a grim reminder that, and I quote, this is the quote in the middle, multiplying materials intensifies the inequality between those who have and those who haven't. This is the worst wound from which the social body can suffer. It is a wound through which the body is bled to death, unquote. I will conclude my essay by mentioning that 100 years later, reading this essay, especially during COP26, has been an anguishing experience. Without acknowledging our human and non-human differences in an unevenly globalized world, our contradictory but nourishing role in each other's life and society, and our sociological inequalities and the ethical, political duties to giving back and overcoming the inequalities together, all climate pledges, unfortunately, will sound like what climate activist Greta Thunberg has aptly called blah, blah, blah. And I stop it there.
Thank you very much, Shirit. That was tremendous. And thank you for that, taking us through and reminding us of Tagore's very prescient warning for our own era, and for the relevance of that warning to the current debate, the crucial debate that's occurring in this city just at the moment, in its last couple of days, terribly important days for the future of the planet, actually. So we now, thank you all, thanks for those 4 tremendous papers. They've been really, really illuminating. And thank you all the 4 speakers for keeping so well to the time slots. That was incredibly well disciplined. Thank you. We've now got time, 10 minutes for questions and answers. So I wonder if the 4 panelists could turn their videos on and unmute themselves. And we can then take some questions. And there are now, I'm going to sort of field those. There are a couple of questions on the Q&A. So I'll start with a question from Nazmul. I'll just read it out. And again, this will be really addressed to any of the speakers. Tagore was the pioneer in modern agriculture in Bengal. He started modern cultivation in East Bengal, present-day Bangladesh. He even sent one of his sons to USA to learn modern cultivation. Question is, what motivated Tagore to natural agriculture in Bengal? Was it his affiliation with the Brahma religion? So it's really up for anyone. Who would like to respond?
I think we need Bashabi in on that one. I honestly don't know enough about that particular link with Tagore. And obviously I'm coming from the Geddes end of things, but I think he just shared an absolute love of nature with Geddes.
Okay, thank you. Well, perhaps possibly, Bashabi, do you have anything to add there?
Well, I think Murdo is right. They both had a similar approach to the environment. And the question about the Brahmo religion, Rabindranath actually began his ashram, his school, in the Brahmacharya tradition. But then with time, he actually moved away from that, though he turned to the Upanishads for his philosophical and spiritual thoughts, but his own institution actually was made consciously into a secular institution, where he went back to the folk traditions, the folk customs, and I think that says a lot about his religion, the people, the land, and the environment. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Bashabi. That sounds like a very good answer to me. I hope that's that Nazmul is okay, and I'm sure that he will feel his questions been answered. So I'm going to move on to our next question from Beth Junor. And Beth thanks Dabarati in particular for widening our understanding of modernism. She says, I wonder if you and the others could say something about the relationship between modernism and nationalism, and especially what words of warning or caution would Rabindranath and Geddes have about today's movement for independence, which can veer into nationalism, thinking about here in Scotland. So a very topical question. Over to anyone in the panel.
Well,
thank you, Beth. Actually, yes, I was trying to talk about modernism from the point of view of how there seem to be different senses of modernism in different parts of the world in a way. And yes, in this sense, modernism could be related to a kind of idea about shutting up within oneself and not moving beyond one's national boundaries, not thinking of not cosmopolitanism, because at least Tagore didn't like the word cosmopolitanism. He would have preferred the word internationalism. And if by nationalism you're trying to talk about something which clamps us up within ourselves, then of course the nature of this movement inward is not acceptable, I think, either to Geddes or Tagore, because what they were doing was they were thinking in terms of the microcosm, no doubt. They were thinking in terms of the local, but actually their thoughts were always relating the local with the global in the environmental sense, in the sense of one's national identity, international presence, and solidarity with all that existed on earth, human and non-human. So perhaps they would have not have thought, they didn't think of nationalism in this way at all, the way other people during the modern period had done. So that is my belief.
Thanks, Dabarati. That's very helpful. Murdo, were you wanted to come in there?
Yes, yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think one of the problems is that the way that nationalism has been used in the 20th century is actually almost identical to imperialism. I mean, it's big nation, expansionist, but inward-looking nationalism. And I think Geddes's nationalism, and if we wanted to say that Tagore had any nationalism, was actually based on a localism and looking out to an internationalism. So Geddes's nationalism would be intrinsically internationalist. Now, of course, the word national implies international anyway. I think that's the way Geddes would look at it. And he was very, very careful whenever he was looking at political nationalism, say Home Rule for Scotland or anything like that. He was always saying this must be culture-led. So his nationalism was always culture-led, but actually culture in the most international sense. I mean, the cultural revivals he was interested in Scotland were exactly cognate to the cultural revivals which he helped to support in India and other places. So I think in terms of both Geddes and Tagore, we need to move away from the easy 20th century notion of nationalism and actually to see nationalism as actually being a category of internationalism.
Thank you, Murdo. That's and it was certainly very interesting participating on the march on Saturday to Glasgow Green, where there was a strong sense of the importance, the links between the global environmental movement and the independence movement in Scotland. I certainly felt that, and I know a lot of other people there did too.
Yeah, exactly.
I think so. Perhaps we've got time for one more question. Do we, Bashabi? Have we got time for one last question?
Yes, go on.
Okay. Can I then turn to having mentioned Saturday and mentioned the COP26 question from David Manderson, I think from David. Do the speakers feel that COP26 has increased the urgency of Tagore and Geddes's views on veracity, and what Shurab was talking about, the epidemic of veracity?
Yeah, I'll be quick with it. Yeah, I mean, like with everything's going on at this point at Glasgow, I think one of the key topics throughout has been how to make sure that we keep the 1.5 degree alive, right? And anything that's going on right now, that we don't have any hope of keeping that alive in the next 10 years, might be like 2.8, 1.7, whatever they do. So maybe like one of the ways that people are talking about keeping the thing low is by something that I'm also kind of involved in, kind of eating local. But how do you do eating local, especially in a deeply globalized world? What happens with the greenhouse gas emissions, and how do you manage to bring the temperature and the climate and the warming low with that? And I think like eating, that Tagore continuously uses as a metaphorical manner, eating, and it comes back again and again in post-colonial writing. I've seen that eating away the wealth, resources, eating away, like eating as corruption. So I'm just thinking how he brings that forward, and it has been there throughout, as if the kind of economic system that we are under encourages unlimited eating of resources, and that needs to be, and that he continually kind of brings back, that needs to be checked. Some sort of self-restraints need to be, I mean, that's probably where ethics and philosophy again become so important, because Tagore keeps kind of reminding us that scientists alone cannot, in that essay as well, they cannot only solve the problem. I mean, here is Tagore talking about 1920. And it's so kind of applicable even today. We need creative thinkers, we need philosophers, and we need spiritual leaders to help us together. And I'm thinking like, when we talk about interdisciplinary, it's all sounds so artificial in a classroom sense, but it has to be the way, rather than only listening to what scientists and political leaders have to say about keeping it low. So I'll just stop here for time.
Thanks, Shira. That's a fantastic answer, and I think it's a good moment perhaps to bring this first section of the session to a close. To thank our four speakers for such wonderful papers and really for opening up this topic. And it's been a great pleasure to chair and convene this session. So thank you so much, and thank you to the audience also for your questions. So I'll just hand over to Bashabi now, who's going to be convening the second session. So over to you, Bashabi.
Well, thank you, Nigel. Very well chaired and some excellent presentation and lots of food for thought for all of us. Could I please request the poets to turn on their microphones and turn on their videos so that we can all see you? And if anybody is doubled up as Bashabi Fraser, if we could have their names changed. So that'll be great. I can see Gerda and Joyce, and could we also have Nandini, are you there?
Yes.
Yes,
but
I think, is it possible to turn your video on, Nandini, so that, you know?
No, I couldn't, because it's controlled by some.
Okay.
No, I couldn't.
Okay, I will ask Cassie, is it possible to turn Nandini on? Anyway, I'm going to begin. Welcome, everybody, the panelists and the attendees. It's great to have everyone. Thank you. Lovely to see you all. We now move to this second section of Poetry and the Climate Crisis, Scotland and India. We have concentrated on Rabindranath Tagore and Patrick Geddes, but our third inspiration is another Renaissance man, Hugh McDermott. Before we proceed, I'm going to quickly introduce the poets on the panel, and the respondents will be are present already. So I will introduce them at the end of this poetry workshop, but the respondents will be coming in at 6 o'clock. So I'm going alphabetically. Joyce Kaplan was born in England and migrated to Scotland, and has been a primary school teacher who has morphed into a university lecturer in Glasgow, specializing in Scottish contemporary literature and poetry. And it was Wordsworth's Prelude that ignited her love for poetry. She has been the chair of the Scottish Poetry Library for many years, and is the chair of the Scottish Poetry Association of Scotland, the Muriel Spark Society, and of the Scottish Centre of Tagore Studies. At the University of Edinburgh, Joyce is the president of the Friends of Edinburgh University Library and a member of the General Council. Her poetry has always been a direct response to the world around her, describing place and people who inhabit it in an immediate way, which is both lyrical but pertinent, and I think very pertinent to our current theme of the climate crisis. Thank you, Joyce, for joining us. Nandini Sen is a climate conscious poet. She has worked and written about waste pickers in Calcutta who are unrecognized environmentalists, segregating organic and recyclable materials. Her publications are from Routledge. Tagore has always written about marginalized people, where the backstreet entrepreneurs can be placed. Nandini's poems have been published in renowned poetry journals and literary magazines, and she has produced an in-depth research on Tagore's various literary pieces, giving concrete evidence that both Tagore and Geddes were kindred spirits in their poetic and philosophical thoughts about nature. Welcome, Nandini, and welcome, Joyce. And Gerda, welcome, is an award-winning writer, actor, director, singer, songwriter, multi-talented. Her poetry, drama, and prose are widely published, staged, and broadcast. Her collections, If This Were Real and Quine's Poems in Tribute to Women of Scotland, are both published in Rome in Italian translations, as well as in English. Her play, Federer versus Murray, toured to New York, and in 2018, she gave the Thomas Muir Memorial Lecture at the Edinburgh Festival and the George Mackay Brown Memorial Lecture on Margaret Tate in 2019. This year, Gerda has directed a film of George Mackay Brown's play, The Storm Watches, and we must look out for that, for the St. Magnus International Festival. Her collection of short story, Letting Go, will be published this month in Lewitt Press. So welcome to Gerda. I am the chair for this session, Bashabi Fraser. I'm Professor Emerita of English and Creative Writing, Edinburgh Napier University. It just meets an unpaid job, the Emerita status. I'm also the director of the Scottish Centre of Tagore Studies, and it's a delight to collaborate with the Centre for Culture Studies at Glasgow University with Alan Reard. And so Scots and Glasgow University have organized this event, and a huge thanks to Cassie for doing all the ground and background work. What we're going to do is, we had actually envisaged that we would write poetry at this session, but that was before we decided to go online because of all the travel restrictions. So we cannot do that. So today what we're going to do is we're going to read Hugh McDermott. That's where we bring the poet in. And I will be sharing some poems and excerpts from Hugh McDermott, and I will invite the poets to reflect on them. So here's the first piece. The Little White Rose, to John Galsworthy. The rose of all the world is not for me. I want for my part only the little white rose of Scotland that smells sharp and sweet and breaks the heart. Would the poets like to respond? What we're going to do is gather seeds for thought, for poetry later on, which we'll share with you after both the events, to all the people who have joined today, okay?
Well, McDermott here is talking about the little wild rose of Scotland, which is a kind of singular bloom compared to these big, blousy roses, which were, you know, the Victorians loved so much, and which didn't exist in Scotland at Burns' time. So his red rose was also a wild rose of Scotland. And you see them in the spring in the hedgerows, and they're white or pink, or when they're in bud, they do look much darker pink. And he doesn't want all that effulgent blousiness, I think, that we get with when we think of roses. he wants the little wild rose of Scotland. And it does smell sharp and sweet. Why it breaks his heart, well, I think perhaps somebody else would like to comment on that.
Well, I could comment on that. Yes, this is a poem that I've known since I can remember. My father, Ronald Stevenson, the composer, set it to music, and it's very beautiful. The little white rose I think he's referring to is the same as the white rose that Lady Nairn refers to in her song, The White Rose of June, which is the Jacobite rose. So it is a political rose as well as being wild. And therefore, in this poem, I think Scottish history is held within that rose. To me, the whole of Scottish history comes into that rose, and which is the reference, I think, to it. It's true that it smells sharp and sweet, but also that it breaks the heart because of the history that it represents. However, it's interesting because I haven't looked at this poem for a long time, and reading it in the context of COP26, to me, I felt, it's difficult to say this because I don't want to diminish the poem in any sense, because I think it's a marvel, it's exquisite, and it says a lot. But to me, in the context of COP26, when you see all these nations and these people speaking from places that are so unequal in terms of the planet, and that their history is utterly heartbreaking, and not just heartbreaking, but devastating and shocking. The scale of priority to me right now of the heartbreak of Scotland seems very sort of small and low compared to the agonies that other nations are going through in relation, in relation to climate change through the West's utterly irresponsible behavior.
Well, thank you, Joyce, and thank you, Gerda. You brought in both the wilderness, the Scottishness, and the global concerns between you. Nandini, would you like to add something to that?
I was thinking to add something on 2 and 3. But on this poem, I think this has a concrete history, which I'm not aware of. So I'm very sorry that I won't be able to contribute or add anything to this interpretation.
I think you have already said it is loaded with history. So that is your contribution.
Yes.
So thank you for
Yes.
that. We'll now move on to the second poem, which I have selected. It's from On a Raised Beach, and it's to James H. White. Nothing has stirred since I lay down this morning, an eternity ago, but one bird. The widest open door is the least liable to intrusion, ubiquitous as the sunlight, unfrequented as the sun. The inward gates of a bird are always open. It does not know how to shut them, but is a secret, that is the secret of its song. But whether any man's are ajar is doubtful. I look at these stones and know little about them, but I know their gates are open too, always open, far longer open than any bird's can be, that every one of them has had its gates wide open far longer than all birds put together, let alone humanity. Though through them no man can see, no man nor anything more recently born than themselves, and that is everything else on the earth. I too, lying here, have dismissed all else. Bread from stones is my sole and desperate dearth. From stones, which are to the earth as to the sunlight, is the naked sun which is for no man's sight. It's interesting how he puts the animate and the inanimate world together, the timelessness of geology against living creatures, and how, and the door becomes a central metaphor here, doesn't it? If we can open ourselves up. But what do the poets think?
Well, I know he wrote this because he'd acquired, when he was up in Westray, he'd acquired a book on a raised beach, which was about geology. And it was quite a scientific tome, really, but he was absolutely fascinated by it because of the doors it opened in him to thinking about the world in a different way and thinking about the age of stones and the age of this raised beach on the island. And it's really about time and how we only inhabit a very small part of time. And we have to remember that, I think. But also, I think it's about how nature has an almost innocence. It opens itself to the rest of the world, and we don't, of course. It's quite a complicated poem. And it was interesting, and it's a very long poem on a raised beach, because he wrote it all in English. I always found that very curious as well.
There is an old Norn section as well, which brings in old Shetlandic, which is
true. That is true.
Which is fascinating. Yeah. And the way he plays with the language there is also like geology. You know, yes. I mean, language is geology, and geology is language in this poem.
I'd forgotten that bit, which is a curious, almost unreadable bit, really, because it is dense, like the layering of geology.
So can I just add something? So I think he has concentrated on geopolitical aspects of any life, and he has brought in the problems of modernism. And modernism is related to imperialism and also the negatives of colonialism. And he has seen these negatives and he has reflected in his poems these negatives with a perspective of hope. And he has concretely also defined that colonized people have been, their minds, their visions have been suppressed by the colonizers, and this has brought in the national differences. So this is my take.
I think, can I say something again? Is that okay? Yeah. I think that's interesting. I mean, I think the poem is in one sense about everything. And one of the many strands in it, which spoke to me, looking at it again, was an almost a mental health existential element to it. He is I think at a very low ebb at this point. I mean, it's interesting that he, in this section that we're looking at, where he says, "Since I lay down this morning an eternity ago," there's something about time and he's often trying to sort of build himself up, you know, in his plea for the importance of intellectual life. And at the same time, you know, he says that extraordinary, I can't find the line now, but later on, it's monosyllables when he says something about, you know, we must, I must get into those stones or something like that. And it's as if he's trying to imagine his death. through this, what he sees as the very beginning of life, these stones, you know, when the planet was made. So it's, I think, you know, he mentions suicide as well in the poem. So it's an extraordinary poem. It's as if he's got himself onto the brink, I suppose, of land and sea, and this kind of cusp, and he's considering his death as well as everything else.
I think you're right. He wrote this when he was to very, very low ebb. And I think it was therapeutic for him not to read other poetry, but to read this endless catalogue of geological effects, stones. And he found himself engaging with that. I think in a way it was, yeah.
It's as if he's being, he feels rejected by humanity when
Absolutely,
he says,
yes,
in this particular bit that Bashabi has just read, when he says, I look at these stones and know little about them, but I know their gates are open too. This idea that he could enter into this, this place. And but whether any man's doors are ajar is doubtful. I mean, I think he feels rejected by humanity in a sense.
Well, very much so. Well, he did. I mean, he was leading a very isolated life. And
yes, Nandini, you want to come in now?
Yes, please. So I think in this last lines, bread from stones is my soul and disparate dirt. From stones which are to the earth as to the sunlight is the naked sun which is for no man's sight. So I think these lines are concretely reflecting nature in an international perspective. But at the same time, he's trying to bring in the geopolitical sovereignty of Scotland, means which he thought that it might be lost. So he concretely means bringing and mingling both nature and geopolitical aspects in his poems, which are very remarkable and magnificent in my eyes. Thank you.
Well, I think all of you have brought various aspects in. I mean, his sense of being cut up from humanity, but also how the geopolitical nature of life on Earth. And on the one hand, we have the bird, which actually it has a very tiny speck of time to exist, isn't it? I just was wondering how meaningful this poem becomes, because that's when a great poet remains a great poet. How relevant is this? How does it open you up to the whole thought of climate change and annihilation of humanity at this time, a point in time? Would you think that this poem, I know this is an extract, but the extract that we have read, does it have extra meaning for you at this point in time?
Yes, I would say so, definitely, because he's talking about the creation of the planet, and also that, I mean, he says, I've made notes and I can't find them right now, but he's talking about how the planet is how these stones are. It's not about us, it's about these stones. And that in a sense, that is true, because the threat of climate change is, I mean, the planet will continue to exist, these stones will continue to exist, but it's we who are threatened. And, you know, and yet we don't seem to get it. But it struck me as being very potent in this context of climate change.
Yes, because he's saying, where do we place ourselves in the world? And he questions that by saying, well, how important are we? Well, you know, not really. And how open are we to understanding the world? Not very. So how do we place ourselves in the world, and what is our relationship with it?
I mean, this is the, yes, I found the bit, I wrote down an asterisk key. What happens to us is irrelevant to the world's geology, is not irrelevant to us, but what happens to us is irrelevant to the world's geology, but what happens to the world's geology is not irrelevant to us. We must reconcile ourselves to the stones, not the stones to us.
Exactly.
And it's so key for now.
Yeah, that's super. And Nandini read the last 3 lines just as Gerda has referred to them, and Joyce in your response. Nandini, what do you think of the, you know, the sun, the power of the sun, which no human being can actually look at with naked eye?
Yes, there I think that he's emphasizing that human beings, in comparison to the naked sun, human beings should remember that we are puny little beings in the whole universe. We shouldn't try to. We shouldn't try to put ourselves in a very superior position in terms of nature. And that will, of course, bring down our fall, our downfall. He means here is the naked sun, which is for no man's sight. So that is very sad at the same time. The concept is really very sad. If we don't take in our mind, and if we don't strike hammers on the nails in our mind, that we are not great like the sun, and it is raw, and it is far superior in the universe. That's my take. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Is it okay? I think you've analyzed this poem very deeply. Very profound.
And one more thing, means
Okay.
here I can also add that this poem is part of an epic, I think. It's not an ordinary poem. It's part of an epic, which is very classic in nature. So these interpretations can continue and can go on. Means I will be very curious to know about your interpretations, all of your interpretations of the whole poem, of the whole epic poem. So
yes,
thank you.
That would have been great, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Is it okay if we move to the third little poem I have now? Light from the East. I find this very interesting because Tagore also wrote about, you know, the sun rising in the east and that being the message. Light from the east. Though east is east and west is west, now the world's so small, they're bound to meet. And everything that's decent in either of them will get on with each other a treat. That's quite a positive poem, isn't it?
Very positive
points. World coming together right now as we are speaking, COP26. So what is your response to that?
So I should say that he has tried to analyze the world in terms of diversity, So though East is East and West is West, now the world's so small, they are bound to meet. Of course, East has its own features, West has its own features, but this diversity should meet and should be unified in some way, without harming each other, without killing each other's features and characteristics. And so he's not that opinionated, but he has used paradoxes, and he has tried to merge the diversity.
Okay, thank you. And
thank you.
Thank you, Nandini. Joyce and Gerda? I mean, it's obviously he's responding to Kipling.
I'm wondering whether he really meant it or if it was a bit tongue-in-cheek.
Yes.
Because I don't think McDermott really felt that everybody was decent and would get on with one another. But I just feel it might be a bit tongue-in-cheek, and it's almost like a Kipling-esque spoof as far as I'm concerned, quite frankly.
I agree with Joyce. I think it's, I don't think it's, I think it's a kind of, it's a little sort of quip to me. Yes. It's not, to me, it doesn't come over as a poem of great profundity, to me. I think that, you know, we'll get on with each other a treat is, it's, you know, it's very prosaic.
It's banal. It's banal.
Banal. It is.
Banal.
And I think it's, I'm not also sure that it's written with a truth, in the sense that they've always met, the East and the West. You think of the Silk Road, and there's always been huge, you know, since, you know, time immemorial, huge connections between the East and the West. So I'm not quite sure I understand this idea that suddenly the world has become so small, they're going to suddenly meet. I mean, there's always been all that meeting. And it's always, it's been, you know, there's been a lot of conflict. There have been good exchanges. I'm not sure what he's trying to say, to be absolutely honest. It doesn't say a great deal to me, this poem. I don't know if you're allowed to say that about McDermott, but that's what I think.
Well, of course you are. I think it's a spoof on Kipling. I think it's a deliberate spoof on Kipling. And I don't think personally McDermott believed a word of it, quite frankly.
I agree with Joyce. I absolutely do.
What do you
I mean, it's almost like a limerick if you look at it.
It is.
East is East and West is West. Now the world's so small, they're bound to meet. And everything that's decent in either of them will get on with each other a treat. I think not, quite frankly. I'm sorry.
I think all three of you actually have emphasized the irony.
I think more than irony, yes.
Yeah. And also the title actually is something that we can come back to later. Light from the East. So because a lot of people, because East is metaphoric, isn't it? It's the developing world in a way. It's not necessarily the Orient. So we are being enlightened by people whose islands are going to go under the sea very soon. So, you know, we really are waking up to a call that is urgent. So this brings us to the last extract. I've just taken the beginning of My Heart Always Goes Back to the North. Remember, we began with Scotland with the White Rose, and we moved to a more globalized, we moved to geological times, to eternity in a sense. Then we brought East and West together, so we've been very international, but now we are moving back again. So there are few better things in the world, I think, than to recognize what crops are coming up at a stage when that is a mystery to the unskilled eye. Knowing that wheat has a deeper green, barley a twisting blade that gives it a hazy look, oats a blue, broad blade. The beans blossom and the clover fields also. Now the valley becomes clothed as with diverse carpets, red clover, white clover, the yellow of mustard and lucerne, the silver hues of blue of beans, and occasionally the wine glow of a field of trifolium. Meanwhile, the last of the human faculties to be touched by the finger of science, still unanalyzed, still immeasurable, the sense of smell is the one little refuge in the human mind, still inviolable and unshareable, because communicable in no known language. But someday, this, the most delicate of perceptions, will be laid bare too. There's quite a lot of hint of internal rhyme here, especially towards the end, and it's very rooted in the crops around us, but also very humbling in those references, and a lot of color, isn't there? Earth's colors. So I'll leave it with you, the poets. What is your response to this section of My Heart Always Goes Back to the North?
Well, scientists now say that the last of the faculties we lose when we're dying, or when our memory is failing, when our metabolism is breaking down, is smell. And they're often with patients who are severely demented. If they have a smell, it will suddenly bring back a memory when they can't be roused by anything else at all. And having had COVID and lost my sense of smell, I can't tell you how alienated I felt from the world. And it made me think that I was much more reliant on the sense of smell than ever I realized. So I think he's saying something. This is the last of the senses to disappear. Yeah. And he talks about language, of course. Well, how do you describe a smell to somebody else? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting because that is something that is, I mean, I'm always amazed by the adverts for perfumes, what they remind you of, you know, and that brings me to wine as well, you know, where it's synesthesia that actually carries the meaning across, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's the first. Sorry, Nandini, do you want to go?
No, thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay, Gerda. Yeah.
I think the first stanza here is very beautiful. It's like it's almost the creation of a visual dream with the color. I mean, the color is just stunning, and also the sounds. After the first 3 lines of kind of exposition, then he gets into the, you know, knowing that wheat has a deeper green. You get these beautiful E sounds, and then the A sounds on the barely a twisting blade that gives it a hazy look, and then the alliteration on the oats, a blue broad blade, which has a wonderful kind of sense of standing up and it's such strength in those and those sounds. And then the clover fields also, you get the O and the O, and then the red clover and this lovely O yellow. It's got such beautiful, you know, the wine glow of a field of trifolium. So you get these LO and then the L in the field and the OL in the trifolium. So you get these beautiful sounds. I think it's the opening section is a beautiful sound that we have here, sound poem, you know, and visual with the color.
Yeah, there's a lot of assonance there.
Yes, indeed.
Nandini?
So I think he is discovering how to dissociate. It's from the poetry, from the sense of poetic justice. He is discovering how to break prosody, means prose kind of sentences into poetic aesthetics with rhymes. But in the last part, where he's saying that the sense of smell is the one little refuge in the human mind, still inviolable and unshareable, because communicable in no known language, but someday this is the most delicate of perceptions will be laid bare too. So in my eyes, these are very poetic and at the same time quite political lines. It's a very, it's not only alliteration, it's not only symbols, it's not only rhetorics, but it is also bringing a kind of idealism where he's trying to bring in or portray a classless society, an ideal, dreamy society through these last lines in this excerpt, in my mind. And his sense of lyric is also very genuine and different from many other poets. So this is my take.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to, we are nearly the end. We have 1 minute left. And this is Alan Rierk, who we know is an expert on Hugh McDermott. His response to Light Comes from the East, I'm going to read it out for all of us. Of course, it's banal. It's a banal little squib. It's a response to Kipling, and that banality and triteness takes its cue from the great old imperial stylist. McDermott is just using the revered imperial assumption about superiority and otherness and blowing it up in a handful of throwaway lines. So I think the throwaway lines sort of sums up what all of you have been saying. And I think it now, I now need to thank you all, because we just have reached 6 o'clock, and I think you've done extremely well. It has been
Thank you.
Very, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.
Thank you. I have. Thank you.
And I hope the audience too. So we're going away with seeds for poetry. I'm quoting from Gerda here, seeds for thought. And I'm sure the poets are going to come back with some beautiful lines that are pertinent to the times. So thank you, Joyce, Nandini, Gerda. Thank you very much indeed for a vibrant, thought-provoking, interesting session. It has been fascinating. It has been hugely enriching, and thank you very much. I've hugely enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bashabi. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks for inviting me to take part.
Lovely.
Do you want us to disappear now, Bashabi?
But I would like you to stay on, but maybe your videos, I don't know what Cassie thinks, but I like videos on, but microphones off. And I'm just going to quickly welcome the 4 respondents who are, again, like all the poets, like all the academic panelists, great names in Scotland and globally. Jan Webb is Professor of Sociology of Organizations. Her research is about sociology of climate change and energy markets, localized energy in cities, and changing practices of energy use in buildings, very pertinent to the times. She's principal investigator of the EPSRC Reframing Energy Demand Project, the Scottish Climate Exchange Evaluation of the National Energy Efficiency Program, and leads the local engagement in energy systems project funded by the Energy Technologies Institute and UK Energy Research Centre. There's a lot to say about Jan, but I'm summing up Jan's bio. She works with colleagues in informatics to study practices of energy using domestic and public buildings. Jan currently chairs the UK Committee on Climate Change, advisory group on heat and energy efficiency, and is a UK nominated expert to the International Energy Agency program on district heating and cooling. I wish the political leaders would listen to Jan before they sum up everything. I'm just going by, this time I'm not following alphabetically. So Mark Sherland is a creative writing tutor who facilitates the performing writing group, Word Factory. I first met Mark when he was setting up the Federation of Writers Scotland, and is now also the chair of the Robert Burns World Society. He designed 3 early learning packs on Robert Burns and the Scottish lead for use in schools and Burns clubs. He's tutor for the Workers' Educational Association and has concluded a series of sessions with Mary Hill's Writers Group, devising a reflective course commemorating the abolition of the slave trade. So Mark is quite an activist. The anthology commissioned Reforging Broken Links was distributed to delegates of the WAEA at the international conference. He has also worked on remembrance material with a group in Clydebank, all of whom were affected by strokes. Through this project, he developed a package for recording individual life stories. Leela Soma is a Glasgow-based writer and hails from Madras in India. She writes novels, poetry, and short stories, which have been published in a number of anthologies and publications, including The Scotsman, The Grind, New Voices, and Gutter magazine. Her publications include Twice Born, which won the Margaret Thompson Davis Trophy at Strathkelvin's Writers Group for Best New Writer, 2007. Her other publications are Bombay Baby, which actually I think I did a rave review of. She's also published Box and Butterfly Rami. She has served on the committee for the Malgave Books and Arts Festivals and the Scottish Writers Centre Committee. Her work reflects her dual heritage, Scotland and India, and I think she's lived more of her life here than in India. So welcome to Jan, to Mark, to Leela, and now David, last but not the least. David Manderson is a writer and retired academic. He has published a psychological thriller, nonfiction, articles and texts on films, and lots of academic stuff. He calls it he's actually very modest. He is currently working on a critical biography and 2 more novels. He works closely with literary organizations such as PEN to perform in and run events. His chief interests include illustrated talks on films, psychological thrillers, psychogeography, creative dementia, the spies of World War I, often forgotten, serial killers, or Scottish identity. At the moment, he's interested in Scotland's relationship with Europe and is writing and organizing gigs on the subject. He has authored and co-authored work on creative writing and walking, creative writing and dementia, and Scottish miserablism, and is active on the boards of the Association for Scottish Literary Studies and Scottish PEN, and he is chair for the Writers' Peace Committee and has stepped aside for a brief time, but will be coming back again. And he also helps small Scottish, is also helping to set up a small Scottish press. So welcome, David. And I hand it over now to the respondents.
Well, if it's okay. Hello.
Are you starting, David?
Is that okay? Is that all right with you all?
That sounds perfect to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me speak, Bashabi, and thank you to Bashabi and Alan for the whole session. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and thoroughly enjoyed all the contributions by all the speakers. And thank you for introducing me, and it's nice to meet all the other respondents. Is it okay with the other respondents if I say something at this stage? Is that okay? I think we've got about 7 minutes each, so let's go for that. I would like to talk about my own experience of COP26 and the preparation for this talk and listening to it today in terms of being based in Glasgow, which is my home city. I'm sure it's the home city for several of us here. And my experience has been that being in the city where the COP26 is being held has brought home to me the urgency of our need for action over the climate crisis. It's been extremely eye-opening to watch the process of prices for accommodation shooting up several hundred times to coincide with the COP26, for example. I believe that a room which would normally cost £40 a night to hire increased to £1,400 a night to hire just for the 2 weeks of COP26. At the same time, it became impossible to join our motorways through the slip roads because of the pressure of the traffic already using them. So one of the side effects of having something on the environment and climate crisis was to affect our environment in these ways. And I'm not complaining. I think it's great that we have this event here in our city because it brings attention to our city, but it also brings our attention to the climate crisis. It puts us on our doorstep. It also illustrates what one of our speakers called veracity. We watch and are somehow not surprised to see capital move in instantly to follow this huge challenge to us. We cannot blame people for increasing their prices because that's how capital operates. If people are going to pay that price, then that's what they will be charged. And because of the pressure on rooms, so they can increase the price, and so on and so forth. It's very much like the way it seems to me Tagore, if it was Tagore, or maybe in Geddes, I'm not sure which, talked about locusts and the way locusts devour. They're not to be blamed for devouring because they are locusts. And so we are faced with the challenge of changing something which is automatic to us anyway, to our way of living. And I really tuned into Tagore and Patrick Geddes' message about leaves and about sharing, and also McDermott's idea of the raised beach with the need for recovering from where we are and changing fundamentally through the speeches and the readings that took place today. The answer, I just don't know what the answer is, and I'm not sure any of us do. My heart sinks when I see the Prime Minister of India and the Prime Minister of the UK take over the headlines for the opening of COP26, then jet off in their private jets to wherever they're going to. And our own Prime Minister that evening had dinner with a well-known climate denier. Let's not get political about this and partyish about it, but we are in a way living through our own problem. We have a problem here which politics can't solve. And last night I saw somebody on television who said to me, everything is a deadline except the climate. We can put a time limit on everything except the climate. We cannot negotiate the time for that. So quite what the answer to that is, I don't know, but I find solace in poetry and the speeches that have been made today and the readings. I thought they've been terrific. So thanks to everybody very much from me. That's my bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was really profound, and especially the way capitalism seems to take hold of our lives. And yeah, and our leadership seems to be failing us and setting double standards. So thank you for that. Could I invite the next speaker? I just wondered who would like to come in now.
Do you want me to follow up on that?
Yes, please, Jan.
Because one of the things that David was saying, hello Neil, was referring to the money and the massive reminder about the importance of money and the instant responsiveness of capital following the action. And of course, we've also heard in a lot of the reporting on the climate conference that the numbers of fossil fuel delegates well outnumber those from other sectors at the conference. So I live in Edinburgh. I've lived here for a very long time now, and I have actually stayed away from Glasgow during this period because of the sheer difficulty of that sense of access to the city that people live in. You know, and that so much as I would like to be there in person, I haven't as yet been to Glasgow during the conference. So I took my remit very seriously and went back and read and of course listened and scribbled during the talks that we've heard this evening and the responses to the poems, and certainly a lot of seeds and food for the soul in those. But what David said reminded me of going back some years, and when I was doing research actually in Glasgow, among others, research with Glasgow City Council and its councillors. And one of the Glasgow Baileys at that time said to me that it was really difficult to answer the question about where the money would come from for sustainable Glasgow, which was a big piece of city policy back in the day, about 10 years ago now, I think. And she ended up saying she might have to sing in the streets. And I must admit, listening to some of the discussion tonight, I was thinking maybe we would get further and do more and take the climate crisis more to heart if there was more singing in the street by some of our politicians and business leaders and less of the, you know, as Greta Thunberg said, blah, blah, blah from the podiums. So how was I thinking about the questions that we were posed tonight about, you know, by Bashabi and Alan, about how can poetry be of practical help in the climate crisis? Well, perhaps we do need to get our politicians out more on the streets to do some singing. But to me, it was very much, in listening to what people were saying, it's very much about narrating stories of the meanings of climate crisis for people across the world, in different parts of the world, bringing their life experiences to bear on the climate crisis, and of course engaging the power of poetry to engage people's feelings and powers of empathy and insight into the potential and the already existing damage and destruction for all life on Earth, all forms of life on Earth. So poetry is a reminder of the vulnerability of our vulnerability, all of us, and the brevity of life. And of course, the value of humility rather than domination, which we hear quite a lot about from the podium, I think, in that climate conference. And, you know, I spend a lot of time with all kinds of experts, particularly practitioner experts these days rather than academics. And it often seems to me that when I'm listening to those experts, they are so accustomed to discussing the science, the data, the metrics, the technology options, and of course the price tags, that they don't convey what that all means. And whether that is deliberately or because they have somehow become inured to what it actually means and what the devastations behind that can look like for all of us. There is that norm, I think, of disinterested exchange and presentation of evidence in this rather dispassionate voice that, of course, is central to formal negotiations and legal agreements, which are being drawn up even as we're talking here. But that language of economic calculus and competitive advantage, I think, displaces the necessary discussions about what is already happening in terms of droughts and floods and loss of forests, of course, and damage to oceans and soils, food and famine, and our access to clean water and shelter. I feel sometimes that there's a tacit conspiracy of silence in those expert circles in the public sphere, that the consequences are too hard to talk about, and that there is concern over the loss of political authority if politicians own up to not actually having a fix, a techno fix, or not being willing to speak openly about the changes in ways of life that are needed. And so there is instead that tendency to retreat to the language of economy and business. Often the ideas seem to be that if we can fix the economy, then we can turn to fixing climate change. And we saw this recently are seeing it with energy and gas and oil prices rising sharply. And the tendency then for political leaders to retreat to saying, well, we'll just turn to pumping more oil and gas for now, and then we'll be able to fix the climate crisis. But also at that personal level, retreating to a comfort zone, I think, wanting to look away, wanting to hold on to some sense of personal security and control, which those of us certainly in affluent countries are educated and trained to expect. So I think poetry can explore all the contradictions, fear, anxieties of climate policy, politics and promises, and I hope find ways to speak truth to power. And I'd better stop there and let someone else get a word in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. I think that was a very powerful endorsement of the power of poetry. Thank you very much. Sorry, can I?
Can I go next, Mark, or you want to come in?
You go next, Leela.
Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to hear the four speakers right at the beginning, whether it was about modernism. I think by Leaves We Live was wonderful exposition by Murdo. The tyranny of the straight lines was just, perfect about planning and disenfranchising the poorest to make cities built and planned according to who has the money in the pocket. And finally, of course, we had the veracity and Surit, I think, did a wonderful talk about what I did yesterday in COP about taking a quotation from Mahatma Gandhi, that the world has enough for every man's needs, but not for every man's greed. And I think I had a very different perspective going into COP26. Listened to Bashabi's wonderful lecture the day before on Tagore, which was, very enlightening. But I was actually with a huge number of corporate people, 150 people from all over with RSK, and we were 4 poets and 2 singers, kind of lightening up the corporate lot. Strangely enough, there were a few strands of hope. Now, you could say greenwashing immediately, but RSK Solutions is one which has managed to find a donor with £1 billion from USA. And these people actually give finances to engineering projects, etc. And they're going to make sure that the loans that they give will have to have an accountability of how sustainable their projects are. If it doesn't, their interest rates are going to shoot up and they'll be penalized. And the person who spoke was from New York, and he was giving money to 3,500 different companies. But the whole event, I found there was a talk again and again about the importance of diversity, going back to nature, and exactly what Murdo was talking about. You know, it's not the coins that is jingling in your pockets, but it is the green harvest that we need, you know, the green world. They certainly made a lot of references to it. And we had really two very interesting speakers, and how little we know about what is being spent by each one of us. You know, a t-shirt, for instance, just to make a t-shirt takes 180 liters of water. And you know that places like Primark, I'm not just pointing them out, but all of the retail, and there is a new person who started a thing called Rubbish Fashion, and she uses 2.9 liters of water. There were very many examples of this. So there was a little bit of hope that I came away with. I also met the bog lady of Galloway. You know that peat bogs are huge amounts of carbon releases, and she was rewilding the whole thing, making sure that the actual carbon is not going to be set out into nature. And of course, there was a lot about forestation, you know, making forests better, tree planting, but there were so many other things about how each of us spends 150 liters of water per person, which we don't need to. We could do it with 100 liters, you know. So there were a lot of interesting options. At least we were made aware of it. And I think I like that one particular thing a person said who was into how they would achieve their net zero. It starts with one person. You know, it might be just Greta Thunberg. It could be just us reducing our carbon emissions as such. But all these talks, in fact, especially, again, I'm going back to Murdo, when he talked about various things of referring back to landscapes, etc. I go back to my heritage of Madras with Tamil poets from the first and I think it was the 4th and the 1st century BCE, Thiruvalluvar, who's written small couplets. Now, both Kalidasa and Thiruvalluvar, who are, you know, before BC, should I say, they had written about nature. They realized the importance of it. And I would just give one quote, or two quotes, should I say, from Thiruvalluvar. And he said, his rhymes, there was 1,300 couplets that was retrieved from palm leaves. So this is just one of them. A tree that fruits in the hamlet's mart is the wealth that falls to men of liberal heart. In other words, share that, you know, whenever you have fruits that are being borne by trees. The other one he wrote was, if clouds restrain their gifts and grants no rain, the treasures fail in ocean's wide domain. Now we know about lack of rain and drought, we know about flooding, and I feel that nature, whether it was in Kalidasa's Meghaduta, whether it is from any of the ancient literature, nature and man have been so close. And I think this is where the future is. And I hope that COP26, at least in this one event that I went to, where the money, and I love that one saying, golden rules, what are they? The man who has the gold makes the rules, basically. And I hope that that there's going to be action, that the 100 billion per annum that the world leaders have promised is actually going to turn up, because the last lot has still not been seen by many of the countries. What I loved about this event, Bashabi, is not just the talk of the 4 writers, but you included Hugh McDermott. And I think his connections to India, his kind of, you know, polyglottism, should I say, of going over to all the languages, which are Sanskrit, or and introducing it into his poetry. And I wondered, when you talked about East and West and that poem of his, that little bit extract from his completed poems, whether it was because he had this affinity to learn from every language on earth, you know, whether it was German or Latin, and I think that is a wonderful way to spend his life, want to learn more, absorb more. And as Jan said, I certainly feel that poetry can not only heal, but can challenge. It can actually make the world leaders stop with this blah, 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 get down to some action. And I think your event today, and with the wonderful inputs from each one of you, and to read your confluence of minds between Patrick Geddes and Tagore, is so not only just interesting, so hopeful that man, nature, living as simply as we can, reverting to the life of a guru Sishya, is going to be the future. I hope COVID has got us into some small steps towards realizing we don't need everything, and we ourselves, we just decided we'll go to a one-car family, we'll stop as much as possible, stop using plastics, small changes. So hopefully each one of us can contribute to it. So thank you again for having me, and thanks to all the speakers, poets, and you. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Leela. You have raised many, many questions and brought in lots of thought for everyone. I think we had some time left for Mark. So Mark, would you like to come in now?
Yes, certainly. My response is going to be more impressionistic, as I was taking notes all the way through the speakers and listening to the poetry. So it was a wonderful afternoon, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've also been reading the chat as it's been going off, and I will make reference to one item that's come up in the chat. One of the questions I've been asking myself for a long time now is whether or not the state of the world is so far gone that it's terminal, and whether it's a kind of a global cancer, and that really has been worrying me a lot for the last little while, because I've always been kind of conscious of the state of the world. Poetry unites disparate views of the world we live in, and Tagore refuses to allow his vision to be confined to one outlet. So he's a poet, a philosopher, a writer of fact and fiction, knowing no boundaries as relevant to his thought, and no hierarchy of caste or class as a manner to fix him in space and time. And I think that's really very, very important. How can poetry be a force in environmental issues? That's one of the key questions, isn't it? Earth in crisis, now as an acute disease, concerned and anxious. In order to move towards the better, we need to understand the worst. These are all impressions that came at me when I was listening to the talks. The rural versus the metropolis, getting a grasp on nature in the city, understanding that the gaze of the city dweller is different to that of the rural dweller. The tendency would be to view the rural as exotic and thereby alien. Good poetry can influence this alien gaze and change it. I'm reminded of Blake's view of the satanic mills, which is the reverse of the modern idea of industry and technology as being desirable, in some way useful to us. Machinery can be both good and bad depending on what it is doing. Last night there was a documentary on the Bloomfield family on BBC 4, a family of photographers, and Maurice Bloomfield Sr. made industrial sites look beautiful, where his son's style was much more uncertain. Neither is true, as both are versions of the truth, and I'm very aware of that as well. Man mastering nature is a fallacy, as is quickly becoming clear through nature's response to our so-called mastery. Ian Foster wrote a story when nature became so toxic that the only safe response was to live in sealed capsules. By leaves we live. That's a really powerful view of existence from Patrick Geddes. We are part of the natural world, not outside of it. We live by the sustainability of our harvests. That's maybe a paraphrase, but I still think that's something really quite a remarkable phrase to use and to get into your heads, that we live by the sustainability of our harvests. The issue of environmental justice, of getting what we deserve. Tagore and Geddes have the precision of the scientist and the vision of the artist. time weaving careless, ceaseless patterns of being. That's again a really wonderful phrase. That brought me to Lovelock's Gaian principle of the earth as a living organism, and it cannot be ignored, and yet we behave like we are in some way not subject to the results of our depredations. The evergreen, mind and nature. We have the ability to understand the results of everything we do on this planet and are therefore guilty of the denial of that principle of comprehension. The lovely idea of three doves, sympathy, seeing and feeling the world we are in, synthesis, understanding what we do to it, and synergy to work together to try and change. The tyranny of straight lines. This is where I'm going to reference one of the chats that I noticed, and something that I had reflected on. I'm a bit of a 70s child, and therefore I was very much subject to Roger Dean and the group Yes, and Roger Dean's ideas of architecture never being straight lines. I think that's a wonderful idea of not having straight lines. And I was fortunate to be in visiting my friend who's a librarian in Regensburg University, and he took me to see some of the work of Hungerwasser, who again hated the idea of straight lines, and somebody in the chat was talking about that as well. It's worth seeing buildings that are not straight lines and don't conform to that. The danger of designing built landscapes and not taking into account the needs of the people living within these spaces, or even understanding how community must work, how it must be organic. And I'm thinking then of the estates that were built in Glasgow after the Second World War, the drum chapels, which had no facilities built into them, and it had to be retrofitted. And that in itself was crazy. It should have been thought through from the very beginning. The epidemic of voracity, that ravenous greed that was being talked about, the displacing the balance between people and nature, the exhaustion at the heart of nature. And then I wondered about the idea, is nature actually angry with us? Does nature have emotions, responses, and reactions? And as a poet, I'm wondering whether that's something I should be perhaps thinking a bit more about. Knowing that nature hates the monotony of monocultures, are we a monoculture that nature now needs to remove? And I suspect we probably are. Are people the insects nature needs to eradicate? Cities take too much energy from the surrounding countryside and may be considered a disease upon the very surface of the planet, much like a termite colony can overwhelm the resources of its nearby surroundings. Capitalism shows itself to the world through its celebration of waste. That's again a cracking phrase to use and to get into your head. Capitalism shows itself to the world through its celebration of waste. Where a rural economy thrives, its waste is most often absorbed back into nature. That's a really interesting idea as well. The idea of corporeal rift, of the physique of nature, education, cooperative harmony, and the one word, love, that we need to get back to, the one word, love for the planet. That's really my responses, I think.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you to everybody. I think you've given us so much thought to take away with us that we'll be pondering. You've reestablished the power of poetry. You have shown up a society that thrives on greed and cannot thrive. And I will just share one little thought with you. I was thinking that by the end of the century, will humanity be alive if we cannot control climate? And I was thinking that my little grandson, who's 2 years old, will be 78 by the end of the century. Will he live to see the human population still thriving? So with that, I would like to end this session, and I will ask everyone to thank everyone. I mean, you've been wonderful, Jan and Leela and David and Mark and the poets before that and all the panelists. And thank you, Alan. And thank you, Cassie, who's been behind the scenes, invisible, and an amazing angel. Thank you very much. Could we have the respondents' write-ups sent to Alan and me, so that, because we are thinking of publishing a co-edited book later on, including the poet's work and the academic panelists' presentations. So we'll be very grateful if you keep what you have, edit it as much as you like, expand upon it, but keep it for us and send it to us. So thank you very much indeed, all of you.
And one last thank you to Bashabi and to Nigel indeed for steering us through the whole of the afternoon. Last 2.5 hours have gone far more quickly than I could have imagined. And I just put something in the chat to note that so much of what's been said will take some time to sink in and some dwelling on, and that's good, because as Bashby says, if we can get some writing from this that can actually be published and then read again later, that's terrific. But we're carrying the conversation on next Thursday, so hope to see you there. And again, thanks everyone.
Thank you, and thank you, Nigel, for setting us off. Thank you. Bye for now.